Welcome to the Thursday night hangout of week 8. I can't believe we're nearing the end of our weeks together. It's been quite a journey, but we have one more week, I think, at least. And there's so much material. I know we've been talking about possibly coming back around for something else, maybe not as regularly, but just anytime you guys want to come together and chat about the book, we can organize that on the forum. But yeah, so we're supposed to be talking about chapter 7, social sciences. Like I mentioned, I haven't really read this closely, uh, but perhaps we can do like we always do, a little check-in with where we are in the read. So we can just go around like we usually do, and we can start maybe with Di if you'd like to check in with us. I know you did just check in recently, or oh, I don't hear you. I think we don't have. I think we don't have your audio, Di. Still don't hear you. You might want to check the little settings gear in Google Hangouts. Not sure. Maybe the output is the microphone input is selected differently. I just had to mess with mine as well. But I guess just let us know if it starts to work. Still don't hear you. Sorry. Okay. Well, why don't we hop over to Kim? Kim, if you want to share with us where you're at and in the book and how the read's been for you. And you don't have to talk about this chapter if you haven't gotten up to it, but if you have, then great.
No, yeah, I'm way behind on the reading, so I don't even know what chapter I'm on. Honestly, I didn't read for the past 4 days. I need a little break. So I'm just finishing up chapter 5.
Gotcha. That's fine. I think we all kind of needed a second break. I think we had the one break, but we really needed two. Uh, how about Marco? Where are you at, Marco? How's it going for you?
Well, I've been soldiering on, and I have read the chapter. I don't feel that I grasped it really thoroughly. I think that to speak about it in an informed way and in a somewhat intelligent way, I think I would need to read it again. But I will share my initial impressions, which is that, again, I'm feeling the time lag effect of Gebser writing about manifestations of the aperspectival in his particular time, looking at these particular fields, sociology, theology, law, jurisprudence, and that so much has happened since the time that he's writing this that it feels unsatisfying to me, actually. Nonetheless, within within his analyses and within the kind of tour that he gives of what he sees happening in terms of these manifestations in his time, you get to glimpse, I think, or more than glimpse, but you get to become more familiar with his sort of method, right? And what he's actually looking for. And so, and he states those actually over and over. He'll give three things that he's looking for. One of them being the theme of time, the other being a theme of going beyond duality, and another being, it shifts a little bit from field to field, but another being the theme of like irrationality. And so seeing that again and again, the way that he applies it, I think is interesting and illuminating. But there were a few like specific things that actually came through in these pages that I thought were interesting, and I could talk about them further and refer to the text, so we could maybe make this educational as well.
Cool. Yeah, maybe we should. Simply because if we're not all on the same page with the book, maybe we can take this time to kind of to go into the chapter a little bit more than we usually do.
There was some really interesting stuff, actually. I mean, we'd have to like get into it and kind of tease it out, but the stuff on sociology, on God, the stuff on Buber, the stuff um, on Marxism. Actually, I mean, it wasn't like thorough, but there were these interesting points there that I found to be relevant and worth discussing probably.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. We're gonna jump back to that, I think, in a moment. But Zach, how's it
Um,
going? How's the read? Where
I'm
you
pretty
at?
good. Um, I feel a little bit like under the weather today, unfortunately. Uh, and then I'm also like 100 pages ahead in the reading still, so I keep like feeling like I'm going backwards, and I'm like trying to like mine things out of my memory or whatever. Um, and I guess I should probably, if I am ahead, I should probably like start reviewing the chapter a little bit before the Hangouts to like refresh my memory. Um, what was I going to say though? So on like in the chapter, like I particularly like the um, the section on jurisprudence and rights and collective rights versus individual rights, and also I felt like that got mirrored in the economic section where he's talking about how power, I don't know what words he was saying, but how power is moving towards not only the capital holders but also the workers themselves as being seen as valuable, or work in and of itself being seen as valuable. There's something that I'd like to talk about that's more like a broader um, concern, I suppose, or like inquiry, and that like the open, like so he always starts off with, like Marco was saying, the supersession, or the inclusion of time, the supersession of dualism, and the supersession of rationality, and then how it connects in with what he's actually saying in the evidence he's giving is often like lost on me a little bit. Like he'll be like, openness is the, like he often like equates to me openness with the 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 interjection of time, but I'm not saying there isn't a relationship there. I think there is a relationship there, but it's just not clear to me. So like some of that I'd like to kind of go into a little bit more. And lastly, I was just going to say that these chapters, the manifestations, I'm a lot more disconnected from. I've noticed they're not as interesting to me as the earlier chapters. And yep, that's where I'm at.
Hmm. It's interesting, Marco. You're mentioning the same thing about. By the earlier chapters, do you mean from part one?
Yeah, from like part
Yeah.
one and like early part two.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Di, is your mic working? Darn it, no. Okay.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you. I'm not sure what happened. I know this is like a problem early on. I remember Di had a few issues with her mic, and then it seemed to get better. No.
Well, we could keep an eye on the chat box, and if Di want to interject something, put it in the chat box, and one of us will voice it for you. Surrogate mouth.
Indeed. Well, okay. So now I guess we can come back around to the chapter. If you don't mind, Marco, I'd like to refer to your notes about this, because you said you had a few interesting things in mind, specifically with sociology and God and Buber, his mentions of Marxism. So that sounds interesting, and I'd like to kind of know if a lot of it sounds a little ironically anachronistic, what about it did you find that was actually interesting and maybe like food for thought today?
Mm.
Something that stuck with you.
Well, let me maybe bring in one idea, and then come back to Zach's interest in openness, because that was one of the ideas, the concepts that stood out for me. The idea of openness. I'm very attracted to and intrigued by that concept, and I'm very interested in its manifestations in terms of things like open source. And so it'd be interesting to come back to that. But I think before getting there, uh, one of the things we should lay out is the way that he identifies the eruption of time in the field of basically the political field, the political landscape, the economic landscape, and that's that, on the right side is on the modernist, you could say, he doesn't use that term, but on the right side is property and is space and is capital. He doesn't use that word either, but property basically means capital. And I think the idea is that you can make money, you can earn a living without spending any time, right? All you have to do is own something, and if that capital that you have, or that that asset that you have, the property that you have, if it appreciates in value, then you earn money, you increase in a quantity, right? And the idea of time being associated with labor, with work, with the time that you have to put into creating value, I think was interesting, because then that's where the left comes in, right? And that's where you also can talk about the theme of like left brain and right brain. Again, he doesn't go there, but that was, that's one of the polarities that he articulates through the course of the book. So so he's talking about this sort of emergence of the left, or leftism, or and everything associated with that: communism, Marxism, socialism, and how the emphasis is shifting from property and from the right and rights and individuality to the social dimension, and to what is what promotes the interests of people generally. And that is obviously playing itself out right now. That's a very urgent and like vital issue, right? I mean, we're seeing that in the United States for sure, but it's still it's playing itself out globally. And I guess it would be interesting. I mean, I would be very interested in talking about that and hearing your perspectives on like what is the integrality in that, because obviously there's a step beyond that. I mean, he's talking about these manifestations, but he's also saying they're like the initial sort of awakenings of aperspectivity, but they're not the whole thing. For example, he'll talk about how the time quality is included, but it's still interpreting time as a quantity more than a quality. And so then he'll look at certain examples where people are starting to talk about time as a quality as much as a quantity, or more than as a quantity. And then he makes a differentiation between like work as just the labor time that you put in versus the kind of like creative work, intellectual work, and how that is not so much about just putting in clock time. It's about the quality of your time, and it's about more than like schedules. It's about like rhythms, he says. And so how does all this relate to openness? That I think is one of the cruxes of the issue, right? Because one way of looking at the competing forces even in our present landscape is between forces of closure and closure, kind of narrowing of space, right? Like creating more rigid, more strict, putting up walls, for example, as Donald Trump wants to do. He's all about walls. There's a kind of impulse to enclose, to protect, to put up barriers, etc., versus the corresponding impulse toward openness. And I mean, I think it's obvious, I think, that we clearly need both, but that one sort of movement represents more of a trend toward this more aperspectival type of world. And so, but it's not so simple as that. It's not so. I think it would be interesting to talk about like how openness really works, what that really means, like in our context, what sort of is like the actual aperspectival that's emerging now that we could look at in connection with the text. And yeah, I mean that's really actually really on my mind in general, just because of everything that's going on. I think it's very present.
Awesome. Yeah, that's interesting. Zach's mentioning a little bit too about the shift from rights to care, and I was just thinking too, in terms of the Occupy movement in recent years being sort of attacked as being too not specific enough, not organized enough, not legislative enough. But again, those are all very right-oriented things: legislation and bureaucracy and quantity and working within the framework of these systems. And Occupy is this sort of qualitative expression that the whole thing needs to be reformed. So again, I kind of see a connection here with what you're saying and what maybe what Gibson was saying, and also what's going on in the present with the Occupy movement, or even with Bernie Sanders. Well, I think Bernie is a pretty smart guy with economic questions and things, so I think he knows what he's doing. But at the same time, again, that attack is always that they're not in the right enough. They're not grounded enough in practical economics. They're not, they're seen as dreamers and idealists, and Hillary is seen as sort of this like more practical person. So again, I think that tension between this left and right even seems to be going on right now in this current election. I don't know if that relates to what Zach was saying directly, but maybe Zach, if you wanted to bring in what you were saying about transparency and openness, specifically, are concepts like what we have today with the peer-to-peers and sort of this new activism and the commons and these things that have been so central to the Occupy movement and other global resistance movements. Are these things related to the Aperspectival? Are these things related to Gapser's concept of transparency and openness? And there's a mystical quality to it that we've been talking about in the previous Hangouts, that some of our participants have described as sort of like Dzogchen and things like that. But this is really, to me, it's really interesting when we get into sort of the political questions, sort of how is this concretizing politically, economically, socially? How is this getting zapped into the zeitgeist of these new movements? Sorry to throw that whole question at you, Zach, but just riffing on what you were mentioning before too, and Marco.
Hold on. Oh, there we go, Mom. There it goes. So I like what you had to say, Marco. It relates a lot with, it brought it back to front and center, like similar thoughts that I'd been having, and I particularly it almost like if we were just thinking out of my head. It was kind of weird a little bit.
It's metapsychosis.
But yeah, at first when I was reading it, I was like, okay, I can understand how work's related to time in the sense of clock time, right? And also somewhat but then he keeps talking. Where I get confused is that when I feel like Gepser's talking about time, he's not just talking about clock time. He's actually seeming to want to distance himself from clock time. And he's also trying to bring out all forms of time. Is someone saying? Sorry, I'm hearing an echo. And you brought up the point that he also talks about quality time, but at the same time, he doesn't seem to me to be really going into the depth of the timeless, the whatever he calls the mythical time, the back and forth time, the directed time, and then really demonstrating how that full time free or free of time quality is showing up in these various movements. That's where I get a little bit confused. And I might just be not reading it. I don't know. Regards to your question, and also the same thing um, with the question of openness. Like I can see openness as a dynamism, and dynamism um, is only there if we have a time, if we have a movement, right? It's not static. But still, again, that seems like clock time to me. All you need for dynamism is clock time. You don't need that qualitative experience of time. All you need is that spatialized clock time, in my mind. So I'm wanting, I guess I'm wanting like to see how openness is deeper than just adding clock time into a three-dimensional space, basically. Um, I feel like I'm talking a lot, but there's a lot there's a lot asked. So I want to say one last thing. Uh, Regarding particularly like the Occupy movement and open source movements and open everything sort of movements, I was like really deeply involved and engaged in those sorts of movements, and over the last like 2 or 3 years, I've started to see like their failings a lot of way where they've almost gone too far to the other side, where they don't recognize the need for boundaries, the need for rights, as well as care. And anyway, I don't want to go deep into that because it's not like really salient in my mind right now, but I have found myself distancing myself from those sorts of movements over the last few years because of actual experience of working in them and seeing them fall over and over again because they don't have awareness of the value of what came before. Anyway. That's it.
Yeah, no, I'm just I wanted to see what would arise, and I could respond to some specific things, but also I just want to see where we're at in this space.
We're in a good space, I think. Well. Oh, we got a Kim. I'm sorry if we're getting too cerebral here.
Yeah, well, there's anxiety. I mean, that's what's going on right now, right? I mean, I think that there's just like a heightened sense of anxiety, like in the social fabric, right? And we are transmitting that to each other and picking it up from each other and picking it up from, around us, from the media, certainly. I mean, it's like in the air. It's zapped into the zeitgeist, as you put it, Jeremy. But I mean, it's not just me. I know it's not just me, right? I mean, people feel that, right? So I'm feeling like a lot of physical effects from it, like I feel like a bit fried, by just the level of stress that's kind of out there right now. And it's like it is this this kind of tearing apart of these sides, left and right. It's what's one of the interesting things about Gebser here is that everything he talks about is so. I mean, you're right, Zach. It's so inadequate still, right? I mean, everything that so much of what we're trying to do is inadequate. It's not adequate to the intensity of forces that are actually kind of in play, and that is anxiety producing. Like that's giving that sense of overwhelm. I think it's like these people with a lot of money can't handle it. Political parties can't handle it. Our economic system can't handle it. Like our systems, like we almost can't handle it. There's like this feeling of being on the edge of things. There's a chaos factor, and that's not to be too dire. If Nicholas was here, he'd be tamping me down right now, I think. And we can easily also look at everything that's working, and there's a lot of things that are working. So there's definitely an interplay between these forces of, they're almost like these Freudian forces of eros and death. But there is a strong death force going on right now. And to get to the text, there's a passage that jumped out at me, and I underlined, and I wrote it up. I was going to post it somewhere, and then I didn't really know what to say about it. It was just striking. And he's talking about like economic theories. Give me a moment to find it. Yeah, he's talking about he starts talking about sociology, but then immediately talks about the death of God and how humanity has replaced God. But in this sort of darkening of the sky, represented by the death of that patriarchal kind of God, there's also a darkening of the earth, and the earth becomes a grave, he says. I mean, talk about dark. The earth is a grave that we're digging for ourselves, is what he says. And then he goes on to talk about, what is the good, he says. This is page 426, the text. What is the good of directing competition and the distribution of goods and engaging in market analysis in order to, quote, justly apportion the products acquired by common labor if all relevant theories fail to exclude special interests? And then he goes on, or what is the use of philosophical and religious edifices of thought recognized only by an ineffectual minority when they originate from the personal attitude of an individual thinker and are ultimately unconvincing? All of these decade-long attempts to manage the material, the ideal, the political, and other relationships among men have as yet only created more confusion. The misunderstandings increase. Moreover, counter to all sincere efforts of sociology, certain political and social circles are intent on increasing these misunderstandings. All right? So that's the Republicans. The prospect is a darkened heaven and an earth that is becoming a grave. This dual diminishment breeds the ghost of forbidden enrichment, which under these conditions can manifest only materially. Greed for power and profit grow, and those who have succumbed to them do not see that the grave they are digging is also their own. All right, and then here's the kicker. To overlook these palpable realities is to have a total lack of common sense. It is impossible to change them. Such a mentality is bent on death, and at best it will collapse of itself. So,
What a quote. What
Yeah.
page is that on again?
That's 426.
426. I'm just gonna
So,
add
what
that.
do you think? I mean, what do you think of that?
Well, I mean, intuitively, it makes a lot of sense with what's going on, what's going on right now. In my opinion, at least, just the way things are going with the political situation, and Bill Thompson has a way of saying it, I think, in a similar way, but he's using more of a sort of a scientific metaphor to analogize a social situation, where he says it's the sunset effect of a consciousness or a culture, where basically at the end of its own life cycle, it sort of implodes on itself and fuels its own kind of autoimmune disease and deconstructs itself. But I think Derrida said something very similar to what Gipser's saying in this little book, which I think it's called Philosophy in a Time of Terror, and it's a conversation between him and Habermas, where he basically describes the current political situation in the U.S., and this was during, I guess, the Bush era, but post 9/11 as a sort of an autoimmune disease, and how sort of the whole thing is eating itself, which relates to this sort of thanatos, this death drive. But that's what came up for me as you're reading it, just sort of making a connection with more contemporary writers. But I don't know about everybody else. Hmm.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I actually have that book, and I don't remember that that particular idea, but this kind of like eating at itself, this sort of like implosion. That may just be how it feels. That may not actually be what's happening. Like like that, and that I think could be an effect of this fear response or this stress response that's out there. That there's this kind of like frenzy of activity, and we get these impressions about what's happening. We tell these stories, to ourselves and each other about what's happening, and we get engaged in the narratives, whether it's an election cycle or a protest movement or whatever. But they may be a distraction, or we may need to see through them. Like that element of openness or transparency may be what we really need to cultivate. Because there's such a frenzy and a chaos of activity, and the voices are so immoderate that it's it has an objective force to it. Is the thing. Like, I don't think it's just projection. It's not just something like we can control. It's like an objective psychic reality, and we have to relate to it in some way, in some wise way. So I think that may be where the openness can begin to come in. The sense of like an openness is allows things to happen. And there's a sort of wisdom to come back to an earlier phrase of knowing when to let things happen and knowing when to make things happen. Like that's, I think, the play of openness and action. Openness and directed action is the openness like lets things happen. So certain things need to happen now, right? Like something is playing itself out. Like there, some genie has been released from a bottle and it's just wreaking havoc, and we can't stop the genie. You can't like put the genie back in the bottle. Like that's fruitless effort. And so I think part of what is incumbent upon a thinking person is to like hold it in some space of equanimity. Like try to do that. I think like that practice might be really important. But then actually like look and like let's see what's really going on. Like that, what is really going on? Like where is this really going? Like what is? We may not be able to control it, but if we could see it or see through it, and see through all these manifestations, we could, sort of get there first, I guess. Get there first and like establish some like presence for it. That may be all we can do. I don't know. I'm just sort of riffing on it.
There's an interesting conversation going on in the chat about anxiety, and I feel like this is connected somehow with what we're saying. But
it's really funny because I'm really like my attention split really deeply between what's happening in the chat and what's happening in the voice part. And there's like parallels, like I'm like hearing what's happening in the chat and the emotion of the voices and stuff. It's really, really, really interesting to me right now. But
can we bring the chat stuff in? Because I haven't read it, and now suddenly there's a whole like bar of text in here. If I start looking at it, I'm going to disconnect from all from our voices.
Yeah, does anybody want to sort of draw their own connections here? What they're describing, talking about, I don't know. I see parallel processes, occupy. Kim, you said something really. I like what you said about if you're constricted to the level of anxiety, you're not open, free, or transparent. I really like that. It struck me somehow. I don't know. Did you want to speak to that at all?
Sure. I'm just very sensitive to when Marco first spoke earlier. I was like, whoa, wow, what an anxious bundle of energy. And I noticed when you first logged on earlier, I was sort of like, whoa, what's going on there? And took me a while just to sit with it and be like, okay, not really sure I signed up for this tonight, but okay. And just sitting with that and just going like, wow, I wonder what Marco is holding on to like constrict that much energy, like in that sort of like, I feel like there's like opening happening for you, but like resistance to it at the same time. And after hearing you read this passage and what this chapter is focused on, I can see I felt this earlier in the reading where his work was very impactful on my nervous system in this kind of anxious way. We talked about it, I think, in the first week or two. And so I feel like there's an excitement I have in terms of reading this chapter and seeing if that affects me in the same way when I get to it, because it's a chapter ahead. But I'm really curious, I'm really curious about the emotional, because it seems like you and Zach both came into this having done the reading, right? And with the context of this chapter, the seriousness of it, the grave of the earth and impending doom and those types of images, I can see why that might be anxious for humanity and so forth. But I suppose I'm at a place now where I'm not really trying to understand everything in his work so much anymore, as I feel like I think he just, for me, keeps repeating himself over and over and over and over and over and over and over again and trying to convince us of his essential message. And I joked with my friend the other day, because I've been posting about this. I'm like, save yourself the read and just buy The Power of Now. Like, if you really want to get the essential message, I think there's other ways you can kind of point to what he's saying. And I would love to see this book like condensed to like an 80-page read, and I think that would be possible in terms of like the essential message without the same journey. Because it's just like, I feel like, Marco, you could rewrite this book in modern times with technology, and you and Jeremy could like rock it out in a much shorter read, and sort of like the intellectual power of now. Because I think for me, Wilbur misses a lot of the journey portion because it's too like looking down at it. And so I think the evidence here for me is that you're feeling anxious. For me, I felt anxious and all kinds of simulated emotional stuff. So I know that he's getting into these earlier structures and really causing me to be aware of them so that I can be more present to what's actually trying to create through me. But what Di and I were talking about is, for me, if I'm feeling anxious, it's because there's some level of resistance in some way into where consciousness is emerging. And so I just kind of shift my awareness to being with that and seeing what it is that's not really serving that, there's a boundary or a wall or a misconception. And I heard you say a few things earlier that, like, you're saying, oh, it's the Republicans, or oh, it's this, or oh, it's that. And, I would challenge you to say, well, maybe not. I think in terms of what he's talking about and where this book is pointing us to, it's a lot deeper than a party or a philosophy or a movement or whatever. It's like this shit's just happening, and we're either aligning to it, and part of aligning to it is letting go of that anxiety and really being, present to what we can do. And I don't know what that looks like for you. Right? When you're clear, when you're conscious, when you're present, when you're transparent, and you wake up every day and you're like, okay, I'm here to do shit. Like, what comes to you? How much alignment do you have with your magical self, with your part of the narrative, the mythology, with your actions that you can take? And so for me, anxiety is just letting me know, at least the way that I understand the word anxiety, that I have something to let go of so that I can really be in alignment. It's not to dismiss it or disassociate it from it. Like, I was sort of pointing to that as a risk, and I agree with her, because you can kind of do the, out of body thing, but to really be with it and say, like, where is this that I need to, like, really be, what is this telling me about myself in this moment, and what is it that, I'm either uncomfortable with. Maybe it's a resistance to what you need to do that day. Maybe it's a resistance to doing your laundry. I don't know. Like, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just sort of like, I sort of just want to dive into your heart and be like, Koya!
I feel you. Thank you. I'll just keep. I don't have anything in particular to say about it. I think it's a really nice reflection, actually. And I think
Release me!
but
Release
there's nothing
that.
I could do about it exactly. I mean, I sort of have to let it.
That's part of the bitch, right? Because we're
Yeah,
so fucking used to this rational doing, like, I got shit I got to do to serve this thing that's happening. And it's like, well, first you gotta be present, then you can do shit. And
yeah,
you're kind of like still doing it the other way around because it's like we all want to help and we're like not helping.
yeah. And you can get the idea that you have to do stuff to be present, because sometimes doing things, accomplishing things, and like feeling like
Right.
you've gotten something done, like that sense of completion, like that gives you this like release from attention that lets you be present, lets you feel present, and then you associate doing with
Yeah.
presence rather than letting what needs to be done emerge out of your being present. But it's that's part of what that's part of well, I can't say anything else about that
I
actually.
I have a question. Um, I'm curious, like after hearing Kim's analysis of personality, if it actually resonates with you or not.
With me,
Yeah.
yeah, it did.
Okay.
Uh,
Cool.
it didn't. I think that like one way I could respond to that, or one sort of like a faint impulse would be like, oh, that's like would be like a defensive, like that's not me. And uh, you know, I was saying something and making a point, and there was something right about what I was saying, and you're giving me this reflection that might suggest that there was something wrong about what I was saying, and I didn't feel that so much. Like I felt that she was articulating uh, she was articulating my anxiety in a way that I wasn't articulating it for myself, and just kind of giving me another way into it. Like I know it's there, I know like that's true, and I sort of told a story about like where that's coming from, and I think that there's still truth in my story, but I think there's also truth in her story. So, it resonates with me, and at the same time, it starts kind of sending me into spirals of, all right, like now, what does that really mean? What could I sort of like do with it? Like I'm going to like a digestion process, I guess, of her thoughts, and that just will have to take its course. Yeah.
I like what Dai said about living with interiority rather than introspection. Introspection has such a implication of mulling over your inner thoughts, and interiority has a kind of openness to it. So I really like the choice of language there. Interesting. I wish you could talk, Dai, but I'm appreciating all of your comments here. Yeah, so I don't know. Where do we go from here, guys? Where do we go from here?
The part of the cultural piece that he started out with, from the Chinese perspective, on 7, I did have a chance to at least kind of skim over the beginning. I'm kind of curious. I lived in Beijing for years, so I'm by no means a Chinese expert, but it was a big shift for me in my development, in terms of just like living in that culture after, being, raised in America. And I'm curious about this whole custom versus like law thing, and I think Zach talked a little bit about sort of just law in general and that topic, but I'm just curious if anyone else had like a sensibility in terms of like what he really, and he talked about the Chinese culture as sort of like more of the magical sort of, or more of the kind of like earlier developmental structures, having a better cultural sort of grasp of that. And I find that in their language for myself. It's like you can't just learn their language, you have to learn the story and the history and the context and everything else. So it was really a radical shift for me, as my first real serious language study and cultural study. But I'm curious if you guys reacted to any of the Chinese references at all or had any insights.
You know,
Yeah,
I
I
was
was
kind of not
not
sure what
sure
to
what
think of it,
it
maybe
is
because
because
of my own, maybe it's my own Western bias and learning about Chinese history and the formation of the first state, and it's well known for its highly developed legislation and laws and things like that, um, sort of preceding, the West and Europe. So that was surprising to me, to kind of frame it in that way. But so that was sort of my reaction. I just kind of wanted to kind of hear somebody more updated rather than whoever he was quoting at the very beginning. But Kim, are you saying that like this resonated with you, like this description on like 418?
Yeah,
Uh,
I think he's on. I think he's definitely on to something with like a fundamental, like just a fundamental difference in Chinese culture and the Confucian part too as well. Because that's what actually brought me to China was studying Confucianism and then being in a room and be like, oh yeah, I know what they mean. And after 6 months of being fucking clueless, pardon my language, about what they were talking about, and then having like real scholars and people that were born and raised there giving the cultural context, kind of like we read the Bible, you can just read it on a lot of different levels, but like even with more like rich history and context. And I just found myself regularly surprised at how wrong I was about what was kind of being pointed to, just because I didn't have that way of, even the way the Chinese do their addresses is like opposite of the United States. Like, we're like person, street, city, da 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 da, and then country last, and they're like China, province, city, and person's the last thing. It's really just a shift in sort of like a more of that organic connection and that bigger perspective. And so everything about their culture for me is like hinting at a completely different orientation to, and I wonder what someone that's starting there would really think about this work. So yeah, it kind of resonated just that it's a valid, like, mind-bending exercise, but I just don't know how easy it is to even talk about. So I think it's interesting that he tries to kind of point to it, but I just think my guess would be probably futile for most of the listeners or readers to really make that. But y'all are well studied, so I don't know if it is or not.
I haven't been to China, so I don't really know like what you're referring to. My mind, just to provide a connection point, like my mind went to a book that we read previously to The Ever-Present Origin, which was The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. And The Dispossessed is about an anarchist society on another world, just kind of in this sort of like weird relationship with a very capitalistic society. And the anarchist society is basically custom based. Like the idea is not to have rules and laws dictating like what you can and can't do, but to trust in the fellow feeling, of the individuals to make the right decisions between themselves. Uh, but and I think that's beautiful. I think it's really interesting. And at the same time, it was in that book. It's a thought experiment. It's something that I think perhaps has been realized in small and limited circumstances and to limited degrees, but not really at scale. And so, to me, I mean that there's freedom in that. I think there's two different kinds. It's like kind of the pre-rational, the irrational, or the trans-rational, right? Like the custom of a traditional society is very limiting. Like to be individualistic can be very liberating, in relation to a traditionalistic custom-based society. And you would want like laws and rights to protect you actually from customs which might seek to eliminate you because you're different than the kind of identity that's at the core of that particular society, right? And that's what's going. I watched this great the artist Ai Weiwei. I watched a great documentary about him, and he's a perfect example of this. Like he is, like his art is cuts against, like it's contrary to his society, and therefore he's a target. And the only reason that he's that anybody still hears from him is because he's world famous. And if he was just like disappeared and put like in some jail to rot, like people would know about it. But others who are not world famous and who speak out individualistically, like in a society like that, end up being eliminated in one way or the other. And that's a recurring pattern, right? So so the question is, can you have this rational type of society that's not custom based in a traditional way, but that is on the transmutational side of the mental rational. And like that's it. To get back to our earlier discussion, I think that's part of what Occupy was about. It was like creating those spaces where you don't need an external police force to regulate what you do. Burning Man would be, I think, another example of that. And of course, there's different communes and stuff throughout history that I think try to do that. But I don't know how you do that. How to me, I guess one of the interesting questions is like, how would we actually do that to scale? How would we actually make that more of a, not as one like single system, because that would not work, right? Like that's what an authoritarian regime would try to do. But like as a distributed type of system, or a distributed code, framework, like that's the world I think I'm interested in. That's what I want to be a part of. Is bringing that about, like that kind of freedom on the other side of both traditional and modern and postmodern social reality.
So,
Thank you, Margo. That really made a nice distinction for me because of the history of China and just like murdering so many people and just the strict the strict stranglehold that they have, and a lot of different things that even occurred while I was there, like blocking Facebook, hacking Google, and some other things that were happening year and a half that I was there, a year that I was there, and just watching how their culture reacted, and including interviewing Vint Cerf, who's the father of the internet protocol more specifically, and he was being interviewed by a famous Chinese CCTV guy, and they got in an argument about internet freedom, et cetera, et cetera. That was also the same year, I mentioned this before, that Hillary Clinton was going on about the internet is the nervous system of the planet. And so these types of conversations were happening while I was there, and I was there to study internet policy in China, but like just to see like how they handle those things in that traditional sense that you were talking about, and how so many creatives and so many entrepreneurial spirited type folks were basically murdered throughout the last 100 years in the society during the era of Mao. And that history having happened in several different countries over the last 100 years, that's the kind of thing that freaks me out a little bit. Just like, what does that look like? And just to see how Occupy kind of just deflated into a non-movement, and the Arab Spring kind of like looked like it was maybe interesting, and then it kind of got hijacked by more apparently fundamental energies. So I'm kind of have that same question too. Is like, well, what is this really? How do you really build something different with this?
Mm-hmm.
It's sustainable. That really builds a new structure, like not just in our consciousness as beings, but collectively as little, consciousness ants.
That's a great question.
And that question makes me feel really sad all of a sudden.
I was also thinking in terms of I don't know, East and West, and those things, distinctions aside, it's interesting, and since this book has been written, that China has become a major industrial and economic power in the world. Not necessarily at the same power levels, if you can call it that, or economic levels as the U.S., but still, it's like it's this rising power, and they're building cities practically overnight and this sort of stuff. So in terms of all these questions about different structures of consciousness kind of coming into globalization, um, you know, China didn't go the path that the West did to get there. And neither did Japan. If you think about Japan's modernization, they have a completely different way to globalize and mentalize, and they seem to be doing it just as effectively. So it's an interesting question. They don't have as much of the individuation as the West does, but yet they've still been able to kind of become very powerful and very efficient in terms of economics and industry and that kind of stuff. So I just thought that was a really interesting observation as I was rereading this passage about China here, and just thinking about that, the implications for that, and then kind of putting it back to what Kim is saying about what's going on in China today. And I know we have some relative degree of that's not happening here, but then it also kind of is if you think about sort of the implicating of empire and hegemony and sort of all the stuff that we're constantly talking about, and bombing people in the Middle East and drones and these sorts of things and toppling governments. There's this power dynamic here, which certainly isn't the what do you call it? The integral aperspectival, the transparent. There's certainly a kind of occlusion still going on, and it seems to be happening even here, in the West and in the East. So it's kind of like we're both struggling to kind of realize something more, despite the different pathways we've come to this point at. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. But yeah.
There's this idea. I came across it in the work of a philosopher and a legal theorist, I believe, named Roberto Unger, who I hope we read one day. He's a really interesting fellow. And it's called anti-necessitarianism, or anti-necessitarian social theory. And it's the idea that the way things are not the way they have to be. But I think it's also the idea that the way things have unfolded is not the way that they necessarily have to unfold, which is, I think, what you're saying with respect to how like mental rationality emerges in the East versus the West. And I think it's one of the things that I think is dangerous, if not dangerous, that would just kind of give me pause, is a lot of like the developmental thinking, I think, tends to maybe sometimes conflate like the structures with expressions. And it looks at, say, some like cultural like event, like a political election, or like as like playing out a kind of predetermined trajectory, right? So it's like first you have to use the colors of spiral dynamics. First you have blue, then you have orange, then you have green, then you have teal, or whatever else beyond that, and then you apply that to events, and you say, okay, but this has to happen, and that has to happen, and that has to happen. But that's not the case. That's just plainly untrue. And I think it's like it's an epistemological sort of moment that I think we have to have as to how we even determine like what's really going on, like what is actually like significant and what is just playing out these dead ends that Gebser talks about. It's like this is just kind of playing out and it's not going anywhere. But maybe it is. Maybe out of like this a deterioration process that some creation like comes out of that, and then you can start to like detect like what are those creative moments that are arising out of the chaos and the deterioration. I mean, that's basically I think what he's doing here, right? And that's I think really when he talks about the task, I think like that's part of our task. Like that's like our integral homework or whatever is like to see like, all right, what's like manifesting of the future, in the present, like, and through the present and through us, and like how do we energize that, like how do we nourish that, because it's a hostile environment for for humanity. And so wherever we could start to kind of create these constellations of relationships or networks or systems or projects or connections, friendships, like wherever we can start to like constellate those things that like can contain a certain amount of freedom and contain this time freedom and space freedom and uh, this sort of hope or this concretion of the spiritual. I think we need to like look at those and say, all right, how can we really like scale that? How can we like connect that? How can we like make it happen? How can we let it happen? Like how how can we put our focus like where it's going to be the most useful and the most effective, like in this whole like catastrophe that's like unfolding like all around us. That's a I don't know. I mean that like if I'm anxious sometimes and I come into things with like a weird energy, it's because I'm oftentimes like I don't even know it. I don't even necessarily have the language for it. I mean, the language is coming out as we talk. I mean, that's why I really enjoy talking with all of you, is that it's like begins to free things up, begins to kind of actually create these like spaces. I think that's what's happening. I hope it is. Otherwise, what are we doing? Like, otherwise, what's the point of reading this book? Like Kim, you were saying earlier, like, this is quite a, it's quite an effort to get through this whole freaking book. And if we can condense it and make it a little easier without losing the depth, like that's the key. Without losing the depth and the intensity dimension, then fuck, we should do that. And that's like the intensification, right? Is like intensification is kind of like less in more, or more in less, right? It's like more light in a smaller spot, more force in a
I want the Tim Ferriss version of this book.
No, no.
Kidding.
The 4-hour origin.
I was thinking more of like, Kierkegaard in 90 minutes kind of thing.
As I was just getting onto this, something popped up my Facebook feed. It was Bruce Lipton talking about how we invest our energy and the importance of that. And what I would challenge you with is where I'm kind of going to as a result of this book is the importance of both feeling what is coming up and owning that on the interior, and then understanding how I put that in relationship to the things that I do. But like if I can get really, I like the word clarity here as to the fact, oh yeah, I'm feeling that, and the transparency of letting it be, and then seeing where that energy goes when I'm not locking it down. And so what I'm noticing is that for me, it's like I feel like I'm having like Groundhog Day every day now with my energetic system and my emotional system, because I'm putting more attention to this idea of transparency first and then clarity that comes from that. And for me, it's just because of the way, maybe it's opposite for you, because if you're more sort of cognitive first and then emotional second, I'm more interior first and then clarity second in terms of my thinking. And so that's just how I relate to it. So I'm aware of it first, because I can feel it in my physical body, and then that affects my thoughts and my clarity of like focus, and just to get to kind of what Dai was talking about in terms of focus. So for me, this work has been very clarifying and very challenging. And I was in conversations around these pre-existing structures. I don't know if you know Michael McElhinney, but I went to a ice hockey game with him a couple weekends ago, and we were talking about this magical, and we were talking about Gebser, and he gave an example of like where a really great way of working with kids and the magical was. So I tried that over the weekend with my little nephew who's 4 going on 5. and just sort of like really being in better relationship to like what does the world look like from that, structure, and how is that moving through me moment to moment. And I don't really understand it, but I can kind of sense it, and I can kind of feel it influencing me, and particularly the mythology part of it, and getting that hook in. And I think that's an important piece of this work as well, is this, the hook, where we're putting our attention, what assumptions we're feeding about the stories that we're playing into, whether it's Trump or Sanders or whatever. And that's its own mythology. That's its own hero's journey, or its own sort of tragedy or comedy, depending on how you look at the elections. And so, just really being clear on what impact we actually do have and can have, and where we can put our attention, and being aware enough about where we're at to really serve that. Like, to me, essentially, this book has really gotten me very, very present to what I can and can't do to really affect change. When I stop projecting myself so far out in society where I can't really make an impact. And so it's like I start where I can start, and then see different potentials based on the clarity of thinking that I have. So I'm really kind of more going, oh shit, what a waste of energy, what a waste of psyche. This whole psyche thing of like, where am I opening my psyche to feed into these collective streams of shit that I then channel into my body, and then I'm definitely not effective because I'm anxious. That type of thing. And just closing those doors and going, okay, you're there, I get it. But am I really, like, I don't really need to tune into that to tune into what's trying to emerge. I just need to be aware that exists. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to riff on that a little bit, if it's okay. Does someone have their, thank you. That's so distracting to me. So I used to have that kind of feeling of the world is on fire, like there's a ever-going kind of catastrophe that like I need to somehow like fix or contribute to the fixing, because if I don't do it, who will? And I like that's just not there anymore for me. And I put it like I made kind of like a little pithy little phrase about it, that like fires exist in the world. Fires can be dangerous, and they're very important to address. But that doesn't mean the whole world needs to be firemen or fire people or firefighters or whatever non-gender neutral term we want to use. And so like and from coming from that position and seeing that like I'm not needed and the world's kind of got this, and if I died tomorrow it would be fine. World would continue moving on and continue getting it or not getting it. Like my single contribution isn't going to change everything, and that's okay. Has led me to like a much more compassionate space, I guess, regarding politics. Like when I see Trump, for example, I don't get freaked out. Like when I see Trump supporters, I don't get freaked out. Like I really, really get where they're coming from and like why. Like I actually kind of feel compassionate towards both Trump and his supporters, as well as Hillary, as well as Bernie. I think it all makes sense. It's all understandable, and it's all okay. And I found that, like, ironically, in doing that, I actually, if I want to take action, I have a better capacity too, because I'm seeing things more realistically instead of like seeing things reactively based on my own projections, worries, fears. And like if I wanted to start a business, I want to know what the market actually looks like, not just what I'm afraid it looks like, or what I want it to look like. And that can make me actually, or that gives me the capacity to actually impact the world in the way I want to. Anyway, so long story short is I just, like I also feel a little bit of tension right now because I want to say these things without like feeling like I'm being overly challenging, because I'm trying to both protect other people and myself from getting into like a defensive posture, because I don't have a lot of desire to defend myself. I just want to say where I'm at and where it's maybe possible to be at. Anyway, so that's me.
Thank you, Zach.
Yeah, no worries about getting people to feel offensive or offensed. I'm just kind of totally open to whatever. If you're feeling a certain way, you're feeling strongly, I'm totally fine with it right now. I'm just sort of, my own energy's kind of stretched a little thin right now with everything. So it's just sort of like, if it's an aggressive dynamic, that's fine. If it's sort of just allowing, that's fine too. So I'm cool with everything. But yeah. So I don't really know. I mean, I had a few passing thoughts, but they were kind of more fragments than anything else. Is there anything that's like kind of pressing, so just to bring it back to the book, is there anything about this chapter or the previous chapters that we wanted to mention before we closed out for tonight? We got about 15 minutes or so. If there's anything you wanted to kind of inquire about together, or just bring up because you thought it was interesting, I think we should probably come back around to it if we can.
I have a thing about what Zach said about time and the quality of time. And Marco, if you have like something else you want to talk about, that's cool too. Just like this idea of time as a magnitude and the clock time versus all these other forms of time, which have kind of been covered throughout the book. But I feel like I'm just starting to get an intuition for these other forms of time, and just a sense or an understanding, or but I feel like it's hard to talk about them. You can kind of like hint that they are there, but we're so habituated into, like, just real quick example. This is being recorded, so I'll try and say this very briefly, but I went to my girl doctor appointment today, and they're like obsessed with like, when's your cycle, how many days is it, when's the last day of your period, da 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 da, and I'm like, I'm trying to put like my biology and my system on like a calendar to accommodate the questions that they have for me, so that they can make sense of whether or not I align to this, that, and the other. And I'm thinking, and I always struggled with that. And to me, that was one really great example of like, well, it happened when it happened, and it seemed to flow at the right time. There's a full moon, like, it all worked out well for me. And I really freaked the woman out at the doctor's office. She's like, you don't know what day it was? You don't know how many days it lasted? And I'm like, I don't really count it. Like, I just kind of know if it's right and if it's not. And not that I'm not like capable of paying attention, but like I figure like my body's going to tell me if it needs attention in a different way, and I don't measure it that way. I measure it how it feels. If there's some other sort of thing that doesn't make sense. I mean, sure, yeah, if it was like a 2-week period, maybe I would be like, oh my God, hair's on fire. But like that would be like an extreme. But like they wanted it down to like to the day and the date and the calendar, and I'm just like, for me, that was like reading this book. Even I was like, it just pisses me off. Like there's a part of me that's like, no, like I don't know. Maybe that's a silly rebellion that I have, that I can let go of. And just
I'm sure there's an app for it.
Yeah, I know, right? Probably. Like maybe it can like measure my number of arguments that I get in with my ex, but but yeah, no, but you know what I'm saying? Like that's the only like example that I've had in the last week where I was just sort of like, the cyclical time, like the moon, or like that kind of sense of like just a relationship to things where I just don't pay attention to counting like the days or whatever. Like I don't know. That's all I got. Feel free to delete that part, Jeremy.
I don't know. I think you can edit YouTube videos later, but this goes all up. Like once we press stop broadcast, it's just.
Right. But you know what I'm saying? Like that's just an example of like where something like cyclical, like with the moon, or versus like what day, what hour, what time, and I'm just like, ugh.
It's interesting because in the Baha'i faith, there's there's a lunar cycle with fasting. I think it's a lunar cycle, and in the um, in Islam, they follow more of the lunar cycle with certain events and dates. So there's more of a consciousness of like lunar cycles, and I feel like in the West we don't have that as much, except maybe certain Catholic traditions or older traditions. So I don't know, just thinking of sort of like the rhythmic quality to the cycles of the moon and sort of the qualitative aspects of time, and how we don't really have that here in this
What's
kind of culture, you
what's
know?
time as intensity? What does that mean?
I I feel like, well, for me, like time. All right, so my experience of that, like at a very base level, is like, all right, so I'm driving and 20 minutes pass by and I'm home and I don't remember any of that 20 minutes. It's just I've gone into some kind of automatic mode and time seems to have slipped away. It's intensified, but it's sort of like I didn't really feel it, I didn't experience it. And then maybe another type, because I'm doing that fast right now, is that time slows down and that like every minute and every hour is so much slower when you're hungry and your senses are so heightened and you're just sort of experiencing every single minute in the present whether you like it or not. And you
Isn't
can't
that
just
more
get lost in your.
relativity than intensity?
It might be, but for my experience of it, it is certainly like you feel time a lot more. It's certainly more relative to my own like subjective experience of fasting and having a different schedule for eating. Um, but I think there's an intensification to it as well, that you're kind of forced into presence.
I do you mind if I say something that
Please.
helped me with that? Um, it took me a while with the Gebser thing because I was like intensity, like what does that mean? And then I realized at some point that he was just contrasting in a certain way to extensity, right? It's not time is a quality; it's something internal, not external. And qualitative things that are internal, vary in degrees of intensity, not quantity. And so, like for example, love, right? I don't find love in the world. I find love in myself, and it varies in degrees of intensities. And when he started seeing time as an intensity, I was like, right, like something clicked in me. I'm like, time is not in the world. Like time doesn't. A clock is in the world, and a clock ticks by, but time is fundamentally an experience, a qualitative experience that I have all the time. It's like part of like the fundamental quality of what I am. Um, and in that time, in that time, then can vary in its degrees of intensities. There's long nows. Like sometimes, like you're kind of saying, you lose an intensity of time when you lose yourself, Jeremy. But then like sometimes you'll be sitting, and the moment, the now, feels like it's not just now. It extends a little bit into the past and the future, and it seems like that momentary qualitative experience of now for me has become longer as I've gotten older as well. When I was younger, the now seemed a lot more short, and now the now seems to extend. It seems to have gained an intensity. That's what it means to me. The quality of time has been turned up. The volume of it has.
You know what's so funny, Zach? Your mentioning of that brings to mind a meditation teacher, Shinzen Young. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he describes in one of his talks about describing what is enlightenment like or realization like, and he, I guess he's sort of like a word of mouth test to his students or inquiry. He asks them if they'd rather have uh, hypothetically one day of that kind of realization and experience of being present and then dying, like just having this day and then dying, and then or living a full lifetime just in their regular consciousness. And he says, they all say like, I'd rather live a day like this than a lifetime in the sort of not really being present. So to me, like that sounds
Agree.
like an intensification of time too. Like goodness, you know, how amazing that day must be. I don't know. So again, I'm just riffing on what you're saying here about being present in time, and maybe that was what Gipser was ultimately talking about with the achronon. Yeah, you love Shinzen Young. Me too.
I want to bring in something Dai said and then come back to the text. She says, "We are born into time, but we live into a qualitative something that is also time, but isn't clock time." And in the text, there's a part where Gebser's talking about the death of God and the ancient prohibition that, thou shalt not create an image of God, like the mental prohibition against mythic images. And he goes on to say that, God isn't dead. We just killed the patriarchal God, and that you can't have a world without God is basically what he says. I mean, he doesn't put it in a sort of as a truth statement exactly, but just as a verition, you could say. And then he says that like the kind of like the new commandment is thou shalt not have a conceptualization of God. So I feel like the same thing applies to this idea of intensity. Is like can't really have a concept of what time is. Like we can't say that time is this thing that we can define. So the word in like because if we did that, that would be a mentalizing of it, and that's basically the illusion, that we're seeing through. Uh, so intensity is just as like it's almost like a word that just kind of is adjacent to or kind of just askance from the thing itself. It's just like it's an intensity. Well, an intensity is just it's a quality, right? And it's like things have a quality of intensity, like a light that shines very brightly, or a laser, or a force, a punch, an explosion. I mean, there's like qualities of intensity that are perceptible. Like we can perceive when something's more intense, less intense. Maybe we can even measure it to some degree. Some intensities can be measured, but others really like as what it is. Like the measurement does not define it. The measurement is a conceptualization of it, and I think that part of what I am getting out of this book, part of what's you know entered into me through this is this idea of like of of, uh, of intensities, because intensities also like happen. There's a multiplicity to them, right? Like we have intensities through the day. Like something happens, boom, an event. There's an intensity of presence, of a consciousness, of like if I were to suddenly hear a big explosion, like that would be an intensity. If I was sleeping and didn't hear it, or if it wasn't audible, like it was just an event that happened, like but didn't make a sound, and I didn't know it, like it wouldn't be an intensity for me. It would. So um, just to kind of riff, I mean, the one more thing is so he talks about cystasis and synerasis, and this cystasis as kind of arrangements of intensities, like not like not systematic kind of orderings of them, but almost like arrangements. It, I don't know what I'm getting at exactly there, but I think part of yeah, I think I know what I'm getting at, which is that like maybe I don't know what I'm getting at. I think I just kind of went down a dead end actually, but
Yeah, but I can feel you on that one. I wish you would dig it out.
well, okay. Like, all right. I want to go back. I was going to ask Zach something. I don't want. This is not to deflect from it, but it's sort of like we each have our own. We each are intensities, right? Like we each have our own qualities to us. That when we show up, and then there's this, a constellation of intensities that's like a dynamic sort of interplay, right? That's kind of what happens in a conversation like this, right? And so, like we have gone back and forth, sort of, like when we riff, it's sort of like an intensity. It's like it takes a certain amount of time, it has a certain quality, and it may or it just kind of like exists co-present with others. There's a sort of like a buzz, a zap between them, but it's not the same as like, it's like a different way of even relating. I think is like when you see, like you were talking, Zach, about Hillary and Bernie and like just seeing and getting them all, and I was like, all right, I'm not relating to, like, that's a different quality totally than my experience. But I was like, okay, like let me feel that, and like and let me feel like what's actually kind of moving you, like what's sort of like vibrating there, in that in your way of being, Uh, so I was curious about that. That's all it is, and that's maybe part of what can happen is like we just kind of get curious, like intensities become curious about each other, and then they sort of constellate in certain ways. They form these like, and then but it's all like, here's where I'm going to end. The law of the earth is constant transformation. That's how he kind of ends up, and it's like, and that openness is about like, yeah, it's just constant transformation. Like every time we close down, we're basically trying to stop that from happening. Like that's, I think, maybe the resistance you were talking about, Kim, earlier. And I realize, okay, if I think about that, then sometimes I just like want to get to this state. I want to get to this like configuration of reality that like works. And it's such a unattainable object. It's such a lure. It's such an allure. That get kind of entangled in. And so to reflect, like you sort of helped me see that, like that's a particular attraction that is actually kind of like binds my energy, like binds my time, binds the intensity of my presence and awareness. And I think that kind of thing just happens over and over again. And it's like getting free of that is really part of what, part of what the path is, or part of like what the practice is for me, anyway. I don't know. That was a very random, kind of all over the place riff, I think, but it's felt coherent to me, at some level.
Sounded pretty coherent to me as well.
Okay.
Yeah! Go Braveheart!
I like what Dai is saying too. The law of Earth is constant transformation. That's such a dared expression. I need to share this chapter with you guys after this talk. It's from A Hymn to Matter, and I think it's a little book called Hymn of the Universe, and it's like this beautiful poetic expression. It sounds very in the same spirit. But yeah, thanks everybody. I guess we're at the hour. Marco, were you gonna say something?
No.
No.
Zach might want to say something.
Zach, do you want? Or are you just waving?
I just wanted to make lots of body movements. That's all.
Oh.
Yeah, sometimes that's the best thing to do after talk.
Marco!
Hey.
Do you feel anxious anymore?
Oh, what?
I bet you don't feel anxious anymore.
I feel a little loosened up. I mean, these talks actually, like, I come into them often with anxiety. There's no doubt, like, that I go through cycles of anxiety. There's something, I don't mean this to be reductionistic, but there's something like therapeutic, actually, about these talks sometimes. They have different effects, but the last couple times in particular for me have been therapeutic, where I'll feel like liberated afterwards, like just kind of a little bit freer, looser to go about, the rest of whatever else I have to do. So I appreciate them. I think doing 2 a week is hard. Like we're not going to continue doing that, but there's something good, I think that about what we're doing. It feels nourishing.
I'm curious. Do you think part of do you think you would have as much anxiety coming into it if you were like purely a participant, or do you think part of the anxiety is like holding the space, sort of like facilitator anxiety?
A little bit of that, but it's not anxiety. Like I've gotten over most of that, I think. Like I do like to be prepared. I do like to have read the chapter and reviewed it, and I kind of, go for a little walk and meditate a little bit, and I sort of put myself in a space to be as present as I can. But I think the anxiety is more general. It's genetic. It's general. It's all kinds of things. Yeah. So, but I haven't been able to conquer it yet exactly. All I've been able to do is transmute it sometimes, like into creativity. And if not that, then it just becomes like exhaustion, becomes like this autoimmune type of thing that eats itself up and destroys me from within. So,
Yeah, Margaret, on that intensity piece too, that's probably the number one feedback I've gotten from work, boyfriend, family, strangers. They're like, you're too effing intense. And so for me, it was less anxious and more just like, trying to like, hold this, what was trying to happen, all my little clay brain. And like being able to read this book together and talk to folks, talk to y'all, listen to y'all, clarify, integrate, experience, and then just keep doing that as a practice over the last couple of months has really, really, really given me a huge amount of comfort on so many levels. Just to hear the contributions that everyone has, that people are struggling or trying to deal with these things, and then each week just what I bring in that week that I'm trying to work on. And so it's more than cathartic for me. It's actually part of the integration process to experience this with others. And so I've really been transformed as a result of this process. So I want to thank you personally for the invitation, and Jeremy for putting this on, and for the people that have been here consistently through the process, because this is a beating.
Wow, thank you.
My life is better. My life is better for it, and my relationships are better for it as well.
That's great to hear.
Definitely. Thank you, guys. I guess we'll see you next week, and one more round, guys. Right? I think I got the schedule right.
Yeah, I think we have 2 weeks left until the official end of the equinox, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll move into this new phase of time.
All right. Well, I'd love to hear from you guys as well about what you want to read next.
Oh, thanks, Di. I heard what you said. I'd never be able to read it without you too. I miss hearing your voice, though.
Hopefully next time.
Bye, everyone.
Okay.
All right. Have a good night.
Bye, guys.
Everybody.
See you, Marco.
See you later.
Sweet dreams.
Thanks.